All right, our final video of the reproduction section, and we're going to do some final wrap up of a variety of different topics to kind of help just bring it all together, so to speak. So we're going to wrap up with talking a little bit about reproductive efficiency and realizing that the national average lambing percent is 111%. That means 1.1 lambs per ewe per year. And we have a variety of differences between regions, farms, whether you're West Coast or Western States range operation or Midwestern flock, farm flock, variety. And so one of the things that's on the radar for the national sheep industry is to improve lambing percentages. Every time we can bring that number up to 120, 130, 140, we're getting more lambs on the ground and being able to build our market back up. We don't have a national average kidding percentage for goats, but I know that when we had sheep and goats, our goats tended to have the higher kidding percentage than our sheep did. So if our sheep were running about 130, 140, our goats were about 160, 170. And that's just our experience, small operation, just some information right there. And so we need to figure out ways to increase our reproductive efficiency in sheep and goats and balance it with all our other selection parameters, but to make sure we have more live offspring on the ground, raised to weaning, and being able to be marketed. And there's so many things that we need to consider in our reproductive rate. And so with goats, like I mentioned, generally we have more offspring, but the mortality rates can be higher. They're tougher to get going sometimes. Because lambs, usually once they hit the ground and you get them through the first couple days, they're good to go for a while. But goats, we had more struggle with ourselves. Breed. Now, we're raising specifically for project animals, so we have to have a certain breed and type of sheep. But if you're in a commercial operation raising lambs for meat, you can utilize some genetics from the very prolific breeds or those types of things to be able to increase fertility in some ways. Even within our flock, we do select for reproductive rate. Ewes must lamb annually. They must raise lambs to weaning, otherwise they are going to be culled. So we make sure that's part of our selection parameters. And generally, the fall breeding, spring birthing generally will produce a larger crop than out-of-season breeding. We will see about 120, 130% lamb crop in the fall, but usually we get up to about 150 or so in the spring. But we still always want to keep inching both of those upward. The goal is to get to a 200% lamb crop. And that's hard to achieve, and so that's why it's a lofty goal. But anything we can do to keep pushing that bar up to get closer to that goal will improve the available lambs we have to market. Additionally, not just genetics and all of that, now we have nutrition and making sure that the ewes are in good body condition to ovulate more eggs and produce more offspring. Understand that our females are most productive between the ages of 3 and 6. And so once a ewe starts getting to be about 6 years old, evaluating her productivity within the flock and potential replacements. And anything that causes stress, that survival issue, if we deal with predators or parasites or disease, all of that is going to affect reproduction rates. And now, a lot of times with sheep and goats, you can increase the birthing interval. There's some accelerated production systems in which sheep are asked to lamb 3 times in 2 years. So that's 1.5 lamb crops per year. And that can be done with the 5-month gestation period. We have had ewes lamb twice in 1 year and maintain a productive rate. Just depends on their nutrition and all these other parameters. And so you can increase that birthing interval, especially if you're looking for seasonal lamb and not as concerned about meeting target dates like we are for fair animals. But you can do accelerated lambing or kidding. Now, when we take a look at reproductive technologies utilized in sheep and goat operations, here's some of the ones that we utilize. Flushing is commonly used. Over half of the sheep farms will, and we'll talk more about flushing in the nutrition section, but that's actually increasing the plane of nutrition so that they will increase ovulation rates during the breeding season. And that's one that we use extensively, making sure our ewes are on good planes of nutrition and all of that. And you can, if you look at our sheep, that, yeah. Next on that list, if we scroll down to look out-of-season breeding, using hormonal treatments, trying to do some out-of-season breeding is also on about a quarter of the operations. About a quarter of the operations utilize breeding soundness exams in their rams, which is really kind of sad when you think about the potential issues that can have on a crop and not checking fertility in the rams. Udder palpation, if they're bagging up, checking udder quality, that's used in about 40%. And we do that as they're getting closer to lambing, but also after lambing and kind of seeing if there's any lumps or anything that might be a reason to cull. That is something we use. Other technologies that are utilized at less percentages. Actually, I should mention breeding marks or chalk checking. Using a harness on the ram and having him paint the ewes is still one of the best ways to identify breeding dates. And so some of the other technology that's less likely to be used is artificial insemination. And the image you see is a technician that is laparoscopically AIing a ewe, literally going in through the abdominal cavity and injecting semen into the uterine horns. So that is one way, and that's how we have to do it with sheep. With goats, it's cervical, more like cattle. Embryo transfer, not utilized this heavily. Because the time this data was reported, CEDARs were not as commonly used. I think the amount of estrus synchronization has increased in the flocks. Ultrasound pregnancy scanning. Sometimes it's hard for producers to do that, especially on range operations, but that's something we do have the luxury of being able to do, which makes it nice that we can sort our groups and kind of get a ballpark idea of what we're facing for lambing. On the goat side, just cross out sheep, this is goats. 10% of the farms that were reported utilize flushing, and that's just simply elevating the breeding period. But you'll notice on the goat side, 40% use estrus synchronization, and especially in the dairy goat side, goats are easier to AI, so you're going to see that, even though you don't see it in the numbers, it is more prevalent. And so synchronizing estrus, getting the bucks out, especially with the dairy side where they're trying to have kids born at the same time and have groups of goats going through lactation. One thing is there's a lot of goat operations that just have no defined breeding season. They let the bucks out year round. And it's hard to control some production parameters when you do that. And that's something I know the goat industry would like to clean up. But you'll notice that accelerated kidding programs are more prevalent on the goat side than on the sheep side. And so various technologies are utilized, but I do think that we're seeing increases in artificial insemination and embryo transfer in goats as well as the sheep side. Little bit about flushing. Flushing is a tool that every producer can do. It is simply increasing the plane of nutrition, and it's calorie driven. Whether you give like a half pound of grain per head per day, or even just move them to a better quality pasture, anything like that is going to increase that ovulation rate and increase the potential for embryo survival and implantation and development of that early embryo inside the female. As a result, you stand a chance at increasing the birthing percentage. Generally, flushing will work best with females in low to average body condition, and the ones in good body condition may not respond as dramatically as the ones in lower. But don't forget your rams or bucks during this time. You need to make sure that they're getting flushed as well. They need to have that good body condition going in for good sperm quality and those types of things as they're going out, and also because they're going to burn body fat and burn calories during the breeding season, they need to have some extra going in. One of the things that we do, and this was on about 20% of the sheep farms, is monitoring breeding activity. How do you manage something? How do you get prepared for lambing if you don't know when they're going to be lambing? And so we utilize a marking harness similar to what's on the picture on the slide in front of you. And this allows us, like if we had multiple sires out, we could identify sire. We run single sires during the groups, but we do switch sires. Like after a heat cycle, we may put them in with a different ram. But this allows us to project lambing dates. We can make sure we identify the sire, identify females that are not marked that may have issues. If we do have a teaser ram or we put on a teaser harness, we can detect estrus in these animals. The thing is, though, you've got to, if you use the rattle paint that you mix with oil or grease paint, you got to put it on every 2 to 3 days to make sure you have adequate paint. We use the chalks and we try to change them if we see them running low, or every heat cycle we change colors. We start with light colors, so like a yellow first, then go to an orange and a red, or a red, then go to a green, then maybe a blue, and there's a dark purple. We do that so that if they cover a different color, it's always darker on top and we'll know which date is allowed. If you haven't used a breeding harness on a ram, it does take them a few days to get adjusted, but generally, once they get out to do their job, they ignore the harness and just go about business. You do need to watch for sores developing. Sometimes the harness can rub them a little bit raw, especially if they're really active. But this is probably one of the easiest, most effective tools and most critical in terms of setting up your plan for having offspring. You need to know when they're bred and how to manage them. When you go to preg check, we need to know that the potential date they were bred so we can determine, are they early bred or are they long bred? If we have like 2 possible breeding dates, we need to know that time frame so that we can say, nah, these were early bred. Because sometimes rams will mark ewes that are already covered. Pregnancy diagnosis is another tool that is critical, especially if you're in the seed stock business and trying to understand and better manage your flock nutritionally. You can eliminate non-pregnant females, and so we go through every year, and if they did not lamb in the last year, we need to have a good reason why. Did they lose the lamb to no fault of their own, or did they just miss being bred? One deserves a second chance, the other does not. And so we can alter the feeding of the animals. If we know that we have open females, we can do something else with them. And we can also, if we know that we have a heavy bred group, we can set them up into the drop band, as we call it, and start changing their feeding management, preparing them to have their offspring and go into lactation. A lot of different ways to do it. Heat checks is one way, and if they return to heat, if they don't, you can be like, they probably got covered. Breeding marks is what we do. Udder palpation 2 to 4 weeks before lambing, start feeling if they're developing an udder. However, that's a little bit late if you need to get a ram back out with them. You can do a variety of blood work and send those off to labs. Those cost about $6 each to get back if they're pregnant or not. And it measures for certain progesterone and certain proteins. Ultrasound. If you go transrectally, you can diagnose earlier pregnancies. But we go transabdominal and look for fluid like you see in the top image. And that is usually after about 35 days, we can start seeing the fluid with a little embryo developing in there. And as they get older and closer, you can definitely see rib cage and bone development and all of that. I'm not as good at detecting singles or twins. But I'm getting better at saying pregnant or not pregnant. So I'm happy with pregnant, not pregnant. But every time I go out to do this, I do try to call twins or singles and try to improve my skill. You can learn how to do this, but an ultrasound does cost about $10,000. So it is a significant investment in an actual ultrasound. But there are other machines like a PregTone that allows you to do the same thing. You just don't get the image, but it'll beep if there's an embryo present or not. And it can be used on like swine or sheep and goats. You just have to change some settings. And one of the things we've not visited about is the ram or the buck effect, and this is the pheromone effect. And with small ruminants, you cannot underestimate this effect. We've had great success that if we put a teaser harness or have a teaser ram, that we put them out 30 days before we want to start breeding. So if we're looking to breed in May, we put them out in the first part of April. And they go out and then through the pheromones and everything, they start to stimulate females out of anestrus into their estrus cycle. And so generally they're going to ovulate, although there's no heat, and they'll start cycling probably about 19 to 20 days after you introduce that male. It's just an inexpensive way to start cycling these females earlier so that you can have better success in your breeding season. About 10% of farms use them, and again, this is an old trick that's been around for a long, long time, and this really does help. And so during the non-breeding season, you can get some females to ovulate and express heat. Sometimes a silent heat happens and then is followed by a fertile heat. And generally this is pheromone related. And what we do is we will run them for about 2 heat cycles with the teaser ram for about 30 days prior to our breeding season. And then we will pull our ram and our teaser ram and then go ahead and put our breeding groups out with rams that we're going to be using. Or if we're AIing, we'll pull them for AI. So what you do need to be careful of is if you're using this, you can need more rams than you would if naturally occurring heat, because they're going to be cycling kind of together as a group. So you may need about 1 ram to 20 or 25 females initially. So if we talk about artificial AI in sheep and goats, the pros about it is genetic improvement, being able to introduce new bloodlines, and it has changed the sheep wether sire world. And less risk of disease than having to manage rams, lease rams, whatever the case is. You can maintain fewer males too, which has been a big help for us because rams are a pain to manage. Buck goats, if you've ever been around them, oh, they're a pain to manage too, and they stink to high heaven. Some of the constraints or the downside is there's not as much semen to purchase. We're starting to see more and more over the last couple years. And what makes a truly superior sire? Right now on the sheep side, it's all phenotype. Just do they look pretty or not look pretty? And that is a bit of a problem. So we're kind of careful with the bloodlines we're using. Cost of the procedure, it costs us right now $75 to have a vet AI 1U. And then the cost of semen on top of that is about, say, $100 a dose, and that's reasonable. So there's $175 already put into that 1U. And if we're doing lap AI, then we synchronized, and that costs about $14, $15. So you can see where costs are going up to be able to get these ewes bred. Goats are a little bit easier because you can heat detect and breed to the heat and manage them more like cattle. So it's just a big challenge because of the costs associated. But if you want to keep up, you've got to do it. And this is actually the first year because of COVID that we didn't really AI. But we've got some pretty solid genetics in our flock, so we're going to be okay. But next year, we're probably going to have to figure out what we're going to do. And so there's 4 different methods for AI. One is vaginal, where you just deposit the semen in the vagina, kind of like a ram would, and hope it makes it. Cervix is where you go into the cervix, and at least you get it one more step. Goats, generally what we do is transcervical, is where you go in and you pass the AI gun, like you see in the image, through the cervix of the goat, and you can actually feel a little release as you're through the cervix and deposit it directly into the uterus. With sheep, because of how the cervix is built and the challenges associated with it, transcervical is very difficult to do with low success rates. However, laparoscopically, where you tip them upside down and actually allow the rumen and the contents to drop down to free up the uterus, when they're in heat, you can just deposit some in both sides of that uterine horn and be able to get conceptions that way. But it is an invasive procedure that does require a professional to do. We have the equipment and stuff, but I'm not comfortable using it, and so we do hire in a vet or someone to do our laparoscopic AIs. Embryo transfer is not something we've done as much, but this is where you can actually get eggs from superior females and males, fertilized eggs, and implant them into recipient females and watch them develop and be able to get that improved genetics, but raise them yourself. So it does require veterinary expertise, and but it's a way to get outside genetics in and kind of go with it that way as well. But it's a little tricky to do and still not quite as common. On the premier show flocks and seed stock operations, you'll see some embryo transfer, but for smaller operations like us, it's just too cost prohibitive to do. Sure, I'd like to figure it out just from a teaching standpoint, but from a production standpoint, it costs too much. And so that wraps up this series, and reproduction is covered.